He had been excited to move into the new neighborhood. It seemed peaceful, quiet, and well-kept. The streets were clean, houses looked modern, and the neighbors he met briefly smiled politely. It felt like a fresh start. He imagined weekends spent gardening, evenings relaxing on the porch, and casual conversations with neighbors. Everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. But soon, that surface started to crack. A week after moving in, a small envelope appeared on his front door. It was from the Homeowners Association. At first, he didn't pay much attention. He assumed it was a standard welcome letter, or perhaps some information about trash collection. But when he opened it, he realized it was a notice of violation of some community rule. The letter mentioned the height of his grass. According to the HOA, it was too long. He had barely moved in, and the grass hadn't even grown much. He thought it was strange, but he decided to mow it immediately to avoid any trouble. Then another notice came, a few days later. This time it was about parking. A car he had borrowed from a friend while his own was being serviced was supposedly parked incorrectly. The letter warned that if it happened again, there could be a fine. He began to feel uneasy. He had moved into this neighborhood thinking it would be a calm, respectful place. Instead, he was already receiving letters that made him feel like he was constantly under watch at first. He tried to shrug it off. Maybe the HOA was strict, but he thought if he followed the rules, everything would settle down. He made sure to mow the lawn every week, parked only in designated areas, and even trimmed the small bushes around his house. He thought that would be enough to stay on good terms with them. But then the notices kept coming. They were about small things that didn't make sense. A mail carrier left a package in the wrong spot, and he got a note for it. The wind blew leaves onto the sidewalk, and he received another warning. He began to feel like nothing he did was right. The neighbors started noticing too. Some would give sympathetic nods when they saw him outside handling another notice. A few even mentioned that they had been through similar situations with the HOA and warned him to be careful. But most people avoided talking about it, as if even mentioning the HOA would draw unwanted attention. He realized quickly that he was being singled out for reasons he couldn't understand. The more he followed the rules, the more notices he seemed to get. The sense of fairness he had expected in this community was nowhere to be found. One evening, he received an email from the HOA that made his stomach drop. It was about a complaint from a neighbor who had seen him leave the trash bins out for too long after collection day. The email was firm and formal, and it concluded with a warning about repeated offenses. He read it multiple times, trying to find a logical explanation. He had taken the bins in as soon as they were emptied. There was nothing wrong. But according to the HOA, he had broken the rule. The pressure started to weigh on him. Every morning, he would check the lawn, the sidewalk, the driveway, and even the small garden around his house to make sure everything was perfect. He began to feel anxious about small things, worrying that the slightest mistake could trigger another notice. Even simple activities like letting the dog out or bringing in groceries started to feel stressful. It was like living under constant surveillance. Then came the first direct confrontation. A board member knocked on his door unexpectedly. The conversation started politely enough, but quickly turned accusatory. The board member listed minor violations from the past month and suggested that he had been careless. He tried to explain, to point out that he had corrected some of the issues already, but the board member was uninterested. The meeting ended with a pointed warning that more violations could lead to fines or even legal action. He felt humiliated, standing there at his own front door, being scolded for things that felt trivial. After that encounter, he noticed how the other neighbors seemed to act differently. Some avoided eye contact, some whispered when they passed by, and a few even stared in judgment. It felt like the HOA's influence had spread through the community, shaping not just rules, but also social behavior. He realized he was no longer just dealing with letters and emails. The atmosphere around him was tense. He felt isolated in a place where he had hoped to feel at home. He began to document everything. Every letter, every email, and every conversation was carefully recorded. He thought it was important to keep a clear record, even if he didn't yet know what he would do with it. At the same time, he tried to maintain normal routines, mowing the lawn, cleaning the driveway, and keeping the house orderly. But the anxiety lingered. It wasn't just the rules or the notices. It was the feeling that someone was constantly watching. Waiting for a mistake, his family and friends noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more cautious, and easily irritated. He didn't talk much about the HOA at first, not wanting to seem dramatic or overreacting. But eventually, he shared the letters and emails with a close friend. The friend was shocked at how strict and unreasonable the rules seemed, and encouraged him to take them seriously but also to stand up for himself if needed. One weekend, he attended a casual neighborhood barbecue, hoping to feel some connection with the community. But even there, he felt tension. A few people made subtle comments about his lawn or his parking, and he realized that the HOA's reach was not just in letters, it was in the way people interacted with each other. Social pressure was as real as the official notices. He left the barbecue feeling drained and more determined to understand exactly what he was facing. The turning point in this first part of the story was subtle. He began to notice patterns in the notices and the behavior of the HOA. Certain rules were enforced strictly against him, while other neighbors seemed to receive leniency. Complaints were often vague, and the language in the letters was formal and intimidating. He started to realize that the challenge wasn't just following the rules, it was navigating a system that seemed designed to confuse and pressure him. Despite the stress, he also found small victories. Correcting one minor violation led to a quiet acknowledgement from the HOA, though not always explicitly. A few neighbors quietly praised him for keeping his yard neat. These moments reminded him that not everything in the neighborhood was against him. There were small signs that if he approached the situation carefully, he could maintain his dignity and maybe even push back against unfair treatment by the end of the first month. He had transformed from an excited newcomer into someone who was cautious, observant, and quietly strategic. He no longer assumed the neighborhood would be simple or fair. Instead, he understood that he needed to be deliberate in every action, to pay attention to every letter, and to consider every interaction with neighbors and HOA members. The sense of normalcy he had expected was gone, replaced by vigilance and determination. The first notices had been small, almost invisible disruptions, but they had set the stage for a deeper conflict, one that would require patience, preparation, and courage to face. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. He also felt the first spark of resilience, the understanding that he could survive this challenge, and maybe even turn it to his advantage. The days after the first notices were the hardest. Every sound outside made him tense. Every glance from a neighbor felt like judgment. Every little detail in his yard became a source of worry. He had thought moving to a nice neighborhood meant peace and freedom. But instead, it had become a minefield of rules and subtle threats. The HOA seemed to watch him closely, and he felt trapped in a place that should have felt like home. It started with letters that piled up faster than he could manage. Some were about things he could easily correct, like overgrown grass or an uneven hedge. Others seemed trivial or impossible to fix. A note complained that a small garden decoration was too tall. Another mentioned a trash can that had been out for only a few hours longer than the rules allowed. Each notice was formal, precise, and unmistakably meant to intimidate. He began to dread checking the mailbox, knowing that each envelope could carry new frustration or even threats of fines. Then the fines started arriving. At first, they were small, almost symbolic. But the cumulative effect was enormous. He didn't have a history of fines or violations in any previous neighborhood, and now it felt like he was being penalized simply for existing. The letters were designed to make him feel guilty, anxious, and powerless. Each time he received one, he wondered what he had done wrong and whether he was missing some hidden rule. It became exhausting to keep track of everything. One afternoon, he saw one of the HOA board members walking down the street near his house. The person stopped and made a point of commenting on the state of the sidewalk in front of his house. He tried to explain that he had swept it that morning and that the leaves had blown back. The board member listened with a cold expression and shook their head, muttering about negligence. It was clear the purpose wasn't discussion or understanding. It was humiliation. The encounter left him frustrated, angry, and unsure of how to respond. Neighbors started to treat him differently. Some were polite but distant, giving quick nods and avoiding conversation. Others seemed almost eager to point out minor mistakes, whether real or imagined. The social atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted around him. Even casual greetings felt charged with tension. He realized that the HOA's influence went beyond rules. It shaped how people behaved toward him. He wasn't just fighting notices and fines. He was navigating a network of subtle social pressure. Despite this, he tried to maintain his routines. He mowed the lawn early in the morning, trimmed bushes, and carefully placed decorations exactly where they were allowed. He parked precisely where he was supposed to, measured distances with a tape measure, and double-checked trash collection rules. But no matter how meticulous he was, it never seemed enough. Each corrective action was quickly followed by a new notice or complaint. The effort felt endless, and the emotional toll was heavy. The constant stress began affecting his personal life. He found it hard to relax at home, and small problems seemed magnified. Sleep became fitful, with thoughts of violations and fines keeping him awake at night. He noticed that he was becoming irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences or small errors in his own routine. Friends and family noticed the change. When he tried to explain the situation, he struggled to convey how oppressive it felt. They could see the strain, but couldn't fully understand the constant scrutiny that weighed on him. One day, the situation escalated further. The HOA sent a notice that was more aggressive than before. It accused him of multiple violations, some of which were clearly unfounded. The language was threatening, implying legal action if he didn't comply immediately. He read the letter over and over, trying to make sense of it. He felt a mix of anger and fear. The unfairness of it all was crushing. It seemed like no matter what he did, he was being targeted the next week. The HOA arranged a meeting that he was required to attend. The letter suggested it was a routine discussion, but he knew it was more than that. The tone of the communication had changed from formal warnings to direct confrontation. He tried to prepare mentally, but the anxiety was overwhelming. He wondered if he would be able to defend himself, or if the meeting would simply be another attempt to humiliate him in front of neighbors. On the day of the meeting, he arrived early, dressed neatly, trying to appear calm and composed. The room was small, with a long table where the board members sat. Other neighbors were present, some quietly observing. The atmosphere was tense. As the meeting began, he listened to the board members listing supposed violations. Each accusation seemed trivial, but together they painted a picture of carelessness or disregard for the rules. He tried to speak up to explain some of the points, but he was interrupted repeatedly. The interruptions were not just discourteous, they were strategic, designed to make him lose confidence and appear defensive. During the meeting, one board member made a personal remark about his character. It was subtle, almost casual, but it stung. The suggestion that he was irresponsible or inattentive was meant to undermine his credibility. He felt anger rising, but forced himself to remain calm. He realized that reacting emotionally would only give the board more power. Instead, he took notes, documented each statement, and made mental notes about inconsistencies in their claims. It was a difficult exercise in restraint, but he understood that this confrontation required careful strategy, not impulsive reaction. Some neighbors whispered to each other, and he noticed their reactions. Some seemed sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few looked critical. It became clear that the board's influence extended beyond letters and meetings. It shaped the social fabric of the community. The realization was unsettling. He had assumed that fairness and logic would prevail in the neighborhood. Instead, he was learning that power dynamics and perception could be as impactful as written rules. After the meeting, he felt drained, but also more determined. He began to understand that winning the battle would not come from emotion or argument alone. He needed evidence, documentation, and strategy. He spent the following days organizing the letters, emails, and notices, noting dates, times, and content. He also made observations about how the rules were applied inconsistently across neighbors. This preparation was tedious, but it gave him a sense of control. In a situation where the HOA seemed to hold all the power, organizing facts was a way to reclaim some influence. In the evenings, he reflected on the social dynamics at play. The neighborhood that had seemed friendly now felt like a stage where perception and authority mattered more than fairness. He realized that small victories could be psychological as well as practical. A neighbor offering a quiet nod of support, a correction of misinformation in a letter, or simply standing firm during a meeting were all steps toward balance. Each moment of awareness and preparation strengthened him for the challenges ahead, the pressure of constant scrutiny. Threats of fines and subtle humiliation was heavy. But he also noticed a shift in himself. The fear was still present, but it was accompanied by a growing resilience. He became more attentive, more careful, and more strategic in his interactions. Where once he had reacted impulsively or defensively, he now paused, observed, and planned. This shift in approach would be crucial for what was coming next. He realized that survival in this environment required more than following the rules. It required understanding the system, documenting every detail, and preparing for confrontation on his own terms. As part 2 of his story closes, the tension is at its peak. He is no longer just a new resident facing minor violations. He is a person under scrutiny, learning the social and procedural pressures of the HOA system. The fines, letters, and meetings have escalated the situation, but they have also sparked a quiet determination. He knows that to turn the situation around, he must prepare carefully, observe keenly, and act strategically. The battle is becoming clearer, and he is starting to see the path that will allow him to reclaim dignity and fairness in a community that has become unexpectedly hostile. The day of the big meeting arrived, and he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He had spent weeks preparing, gathering every letter, email, and notice he had received. He had taken notes on inconsistencies, highlighted selective enforcement, even found sections of the HOA bylaws that the board had overlooked or misapplied. Every detail was organized carefully, and he rehearsed how he would speak, staying calm and focused. He knew this meeting could change everything if he approached it correctly. When he entered the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. The board members were already seated, confident, and ready to assert their authority. Some neighbors were there too, quietly observing. He could feel the weight of the room, the expectation that he would be intimidated and perhaps give up. But he reminded himself why he was there: to set the record straight, to show that fairness mattered, and to stand up for himself and his home. The meeting began with the usual formalities. But he quickly realized this was more than routine. The board started listing violations, some recent and some from weeks before. Each accusation was presented as if it were undeniable fact. He listened carefully, taking notes and mentally marking points where he had clear evidence to counter their claims. He reminded himself to stay calm, to avoid getting emotional, and to respond with facts. When it was his turn to speak, he started calmly, presenting his documents one by one. He showed emails that proved he had addressed previous concerns, photographs of his yard and property showing compliance, and even references from the HOA rules themselves that contradicted some of the board's claims. As he spoke, the room grew quiet. The board members tried to interrupt, but he had anticipated this and politely but firmly requested to finish before responding to questions. His tone was steady, and his preparation showed. Neighbors who had been silently watching began to lean in. Some whispered to each other, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of his evidence. The dynamic in the room shifted. The board members, who had been confident and commanding, now seemed unsettled. They tried to argue, but every point he made was backed by documentation. They stumbled over vague claims, unable to counter his clear evidence. It became apparent that he was not just defending himself. He was exposing the inconsistencies and weaknesses in the board's actions. One by one, he addressed each violation. For the fines, he showed payment records or corrections that had been made before the deadlines. For complaints from neighbors, he highlighted lack of consistency or proof, showing that some residents were held to different standards. His calm, methodical approach made it clear that the board's previous tactics had relied more on intimidation than fairness. He could see the expressions on their faces change from confidence to frustration, and finally to realization that their authority was being questioned. The room was silent as he presented the final piece of evidence, a copy of the HOA bylaws that explicitly contradicted several of the board's claims. He explained clearly, without anger or sarcasm, why certain fines and accusations were invalid. He emphasized that following rules was important, but selective enforcement and intimidation were not acceptable. The quiet authority in his voice left no room for easy dismissal. For the first time, the board was being held accountable, and the audience understood that. A tense few minutes passed as the board members conferred quietly among themselves. He stayed calm, knowing that this pause was critical. It showed that they could not immediately respond with authority, because his evidence and preparation had created a situation where they could not easily deny facts. The neighbors who had been observing began to murmur support, adding subtle pressure. It was clear that the meeting had shifted from a routine review of violations to a pivotal moment where fairness and accountability were being examined. One board member finally spoke, attempting to dismiss some points and assert that they had discretion in enforcement. He calmly responded, explaining that discretion must still be exercised fairly and according to written rules. He cited specific sections of the bylaws and past examples that illustrated inconsistencies. The clarity and accuracy of his points made it difficult for the board member to argue effectively. The conversation became a factual discussion rather than an emotional confrontation, which was exactly what he had aimed to achieve. Throughout the meeting, he noticed that some neighbors were quietly taking notes and nodding in agreement. Others whispered support, acknowledging that the situation had been unfair. The collective realization in the room created an environment where the board's previous tactics of intimidation no longer worked. He could feel a shift in energy. The tension was still there, but it was balanced by a growing sense of fairness and transparency. He understood that this was the turning point he had been preparing for. As the meeting continued, the board reluctantly acknowledged some of the inconsistencies he had pointed out. They agreed to review certain fines and reconsider past complaints. His methodical presentation left little room for resistance. He remained professional and respectful, never raising his voice or showing anger, but the impact was clear. Authority that had once seemed unchallengeable was now being questioned and corrected by the end of the meeting. The atmosphere had transformed. The board members, though still in positions of authority, were no longer able to dominate the discussion. The neighbors who had observed the meeting understood that he had approached the situation not with hostility, but with careful preparation, documentation, and calm confidence. The outcome was not only about his own situation, it sent a message that fairness and accountability mattered in the community. He left the meeting with a sense of accomplishment and relief. The path ahead was not entirely clear, and there would still be follow-up and adjustments, but the critical moment had been handled successfully. He had stood up to a system that seemed rigid and intimidating, using preparation, logic, and clear evidence rather than confrontation or emotion. The impact on the community was subtle but powerful. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak up now had an example of someone who had navigated the challenges and achieved a fair outcome. In the days following the meeting, he continued to monitor communications and ensure that promised adjustments were implemented. Some fines were rescinded, and certain rules were clarified to prevent future misunderstandings. The HOA board operated with a new awareness that residents could and would hold them accountable. He noticed that the social dynamics of the neighborhood began to shift as well. Neighbors who had been distant or cautious now interacted more openly, no longer constrained by fear of unfair treatment. The experience changed him too. He realized that preparation, calm reasoning, and careful documentation were more powerful than confrontation or anger. He had turned a stressful, intimidating situation into an opportunity to assert fairness and respect. The sense of empowerment that came from this careful approach would guide him in future challenges, both in the neighborhood and in other aspects of life. Looking back, he understood that the meeting had been about more than just violations or fines. It was a test of patience, strategy, and resilience. He had faced a situation that could have been overwhelming and isolating, but by approaching it methodically, he had not only defended his own position, but also helped establish a precedent for fairness in the community. The meeting became a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who observed and learned from his example. After the meeting, A sense of calm settled over him, but he knew that change would take time. The immediate confrontation had passed, yet the real work was just beginning. He had succeeded in presenting his case and making the board aware that unfair actions could not continue unchecked. But ensuring lasting results required patience, vigilance, and careful follow-up. He began by reviewing the outcomes of the meeting. Some fines had already been rescinded, while others required additional paperwork or verification. He carefully documented each resolution, noting dates, amounts, and any conditions for compliance. Every step was logged meticulously to prevent future misunderstandings. This level of organization gave him confidence. The chaos of the previous weeks had started to give way to clarity and control. The board members were noticeably different in their behavior following the meeting. Some avoided direct confrontation, others were more cautious in their emails, and a few even approached him politely to confirm compliance or offer clarification on new policies. He realized that respect had been earned not through argument or confrontation, but through preparation, clarity, and calm persistence. This was a lesson he would carry forward. Responds to reason backed by evidence. Neighbors began to notice the shift too. Those who had been quiet and hesitant now treated him with a subtle but genuine respect. Some approached him with questions, asking how he had handled the board, and a few even admitted they had felt intimidated by the HOA in the past, but had lacked the courage to confront the issue. His actions had not only resolved his own situation, but it also empowered others to stand up when necessary. He continued monitoring communications from the HOA, making sure that all agreements from the meeting were being implemented. Whenever a new notice arrived, he cross-checked it against his records. This careful attention ensured that the board could not slip back into old patterns of selective enforcement. His diligence demonstrated that accountability was now a shared responsibility, not just a demand imposed from one side. Over time, policies and procedures were clarified. The HOA issued updated guidelines for violations and fines, making the rules more transparent and consistent. The selective enforcement that had caused so much frustration was corrected, and a system for appeals and clarification was put in place. This structured approach helped prevent future conflicts and fostered a sense of fairness across the neighborhood. Social dynamics also shifted significantly. The subtle fear that had once pervaded the community began to dissipate. Neighbors who had been distant or wary started engaging more openly. Casual conversations became easier, and a sense of shared responsibility for the neighborhood grew. The environment felt less like a minefield of scrutiny and more like a community of people who respected rules, but also valued fairness and mutual respect. For him personally, the experience was transformative. He had faced a situation that initially seemed overwhelming and oppressive. Yet through preparation, calm, reasoning, and persistence, he had turned it around. The lessons extended beyond HOA rules. Careful planning, attention to detail, and measured responses could overcome even the most intimidating challenges. He recognized the value of patience and resilience, understanding that success was often less about force and more about strategic, consistent action. Friends and family noticed the change in him as well. Where once he had been anxious and tense, he now carried a quiet confidence. He could speak calmly about the situation, recounting events with clarity and perspective. The stress that had previously dominated his daily life was replaced by a sense of accomplishment and empowerment. He had not only resolved the conflict, but had also learned how to navigate challenging situations in a way that maintained dignity and integrity. He also became a resource for others facing similar issues. Neighbors reached out, seeking advice on handling disputes with the HOA or understanding their rights and responsibilities. He shared his experiences, emphasizing preparation, documentation, and calm communication. His story became a guide for those who might otherwise feel powerless, showing that a thoughtful approach could lead to meaningful change. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The HOA continued to enforce rules, but the approach was now fairer and more transparent. Residents knew that their concerns would be heard and that any unfair treatment could be addressed. The sense of fear and intimidation that had once defined the community was replaced by mutual respect and a clearer understanding of the rules. Looking back, he realized that the struggle with the HOA had been more than just a personal challenge. It had been a test of patience, strategy, and resilience. The victory was not about defeating an opponent, but about establishing fairness, accountability, and respect in a community that had briefly felt oppressive. He had learned that calm persistence, careful preparation, and a clear understanding of the rules could overcome intimidation and create lasting change. The experience left a lasting impression on him. He now approached challenges in other areas of life with the same principles. Observe carefully, prepare thoroughly, act calmly, and document everything. He understood that authority could be questioned respectfully and that fairness could be achieved even in difficult circumstances. The victory over the HOA was more than a resolution of fines and violations. It was a demonstration of how thoughtful, deliberate action could transform a situation and influence the broader community. In the end, the neighborhood became a better place not because of conflict, but because he had chosen to approach the problem strategically and calmly. The lessons he learned and the changes he helped implement created a precedent for fairness and respect. Other residents benefited from his actions, and the community as a whole became stronger and more united. He had faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge, and through preparation, patience, and careful strategy, he had turned the tables forever. After months of navigating fines, letters, and tense interactions, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The HOA was no longer an unpredictable force. The rules were clearer, the board more accountable, and the neighborhood slowly felt like home again. But he knew that change was not permanent unless it was maintained. This awareness kept him attentive, ready to address issues before they could grow into problems, even though the board had adjusted its approach. He noticed that some members still tested boundaries subtly. Occasionally, an email would arrive, questioning minor matters or citing rules with ambiguous language. He remained calm, treating each communication as an opportunity to reinforce fairness and clarity rather than react emotionally. His experience had taught him that consistent, rational responses carried more weight than frustration or confrontation. He continued to document everything meticulously. Every letter, every conversation, every small interaction was logged and organized. This process became second nature, a way to stay in control and maintain confidence. When a neighbor questioned a new guideline or fine, he could provide clear examples and explanations, helping diffuse tension and prevent misunderstandings. The role he had taken on as a quiet advocate for fairness became a valuable resource for the entire community at the same time. He worked on rebuilding connections with neighbors who had been distant or wary. He invited a few over for casual coffee, joined informal gatherings, and participated in community projects. These actions were small but meaningful, reinforcing that the neighborhood could function as a community rather than a place of fear. Slowly, the social fabric that had frayed under the pressure of selective enforcement began to heal. Neighbors who had once avoided conversation now approached him with trust and appreciation. The sense of vigilance never disappeared entirely. He remained alert, checking for potential violations, ensuring that new residents were aware of the rules and clarifying points of confusion with the HOA when necessary. But this vigilance was no longer stressful. It was empowering. He understood that knowledge and preparation created stability, and he applied this approach not just to his interactions with the HOA, but to his life in general. One afternoon, he received an unexpected call from a neighbor who had been struggling with the board over an unfair fine. They were anxious and unsure of how to proceed. He listened carefully, offered guidance on documenting evidence, and suggested a calm, methodical approach similar to what he had used. The conversation ended with relief and gratitude. He realized that the lessons he had learned were valuable beyond his own situation. By helping others, he strengthened the sense of fairness and community in the neighborhood. Over the following weeks, he observed how the neighborhood continued to improve. The HOA meetings became more structured and transparent. Policies were explained clearly, and residents felt empowered to ask questions without fear of retaliation. Minor disputes were resolved quickly and fairly. The change in the board's approach demonstrated that consistent pressure for accountability could lead to positive results without creating conflict. His personal growth, was equally significant. Where once he had been tense and anxious, he now approached challenges with calm confidence. He applied the principles of preparation, documentation, and rational response to other areas of life, whether at work, in personal projects, or in interactions with friends and family. The experience with the HOA had taught him that challenges could be opportunities for growth, as long as they were approached thoughtfully. As the months passed, small victories accumulated. An outdated rule that had caused repeated confusion was officially removed. A neighbor who had once been fearful of questioning the board felt comfortable raising concerns. Even the board members seemed more collaborative, willing to listen and respond rather than dictate. These changes were the result of steady, consistent effort, showing that long-term improvement required persistence as well as strategic action. Despite the progress, he remained grounded. He knew that a single moment of carelessness could allow old patterns to reemerge. He continued to attend meetings, review communications, and support neighbors when needed. But he no longer felt trapped or anxious. The shift from fear to empowerment had changed his perspective, transforming what had once been a stressful situation into an opportunity. To contribute positively to his community, he began to reflect on the journey he had taken. The early days had been filled with anxiety, humiliation, and frustration. Notices, fines, and social pressure had created a sense of isolation. But by carefully documenting evidence, approaching the situation calmly, and presenting facts clearly, he had gradually shifted the balance. Authority had been held accountable, fairness had been restored, and he had grown as a person in the process. The long-term impact was not just personal. The community had learned that residents could participate in shaping rules and holding boards accountable. New residents arrived, knowing that fairness and transparency were valued. A culture of mutual respect began to replace fear and intimidation. The neighborhood became more cohesive, resilient, and aware of its shared responsibilities. Through it all, he maintained a focus on principles rather than personal victories. The goal was not to win against the HOA for its own sake, but to ensure that rules were fair, consistently applied, and respected by all. This perspective allowed him to act with patience, clarity, and calm authority. He understood that true change required a combination of preparation, strategy, and ethical conduct, not anger or confrontation. One evening, he walked through the neighborhood, observing the lawns, houses, and people with a sense of satisfaction. The streets felt calmer, the neighbors more connected, and the community stronger. The victories over the previous months had transformed the environment. Where once there had been tension and fear, there was now respect and collaboration. The lessons learned and changes implemented would have a lasting effect, benefiting both current and future residents. He also recognized the value of humility and continuous learning. While he had successfully navigated the conflict, he knew that authority could be challenged in many forms and that fairness required ongoing effort. He remained attentive, ready to address any new issues thoughtfully and strategically. This awareness kept him proactive rather than reactive, turning vigilance into empowerment rather than stress. By the end of this journey, he had not only restored fairness in his own situation, but had influenced a broader culture of accountability in the neighborhood. The HOA's approach had shifted, neighbors were more confident, and the community had become more resilient. Most importantly, he had learned the power of preparation, calm reasoning, and ethical action. The experience had strengthened him, both practically and personally, providing tools and insights that would serve him for years to come. In the end, the struggle with the HOA had transformed from a source of stress and frustration into a story of empowerment, resilience, and lasting positive change. The challenges had tested his patience, strategy, and persistence, and he had emerged not only victorious in the immediate situation, but also stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to navigate difficult circumstances. The neighborhood was better for his efforts. He had secured a sense of peace and respect that would endure, showing that careful, thoughtful action could indeed turn the tables forever.